Hey everyone, really quick, I want to let you guys all know that I now have a Ko-fi page where you can donate to support me and the channel if you feel like it. All Ko-fi supporters will receive a special shout out at the beginning of whatever video I release closest to their donation. For example, today I'm sending a big thank you to the MLM Police and to BotWatch. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate your kindness and generosity. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Multi-Level Mess. My name is Tori, and I'm still a goth against oppressive religions. This is part 2 of my deep dive into the Potter's House. If you haven't watched the previous part, I recommend that you do so now to be caught up on everything that I've covered thus far. Just like last time, feel free to skip this video if you do not wish to watch content that is critical of a religion, and please keep any discussions in the comments civil. My critique, like with MLMs, will be focused on the organization in question, not individual attacks, and will be based on my personal knowledge and experiences. This part will be going into more of the darker subject matter, such as the discrimination and abuse, with the more disturbing matter being towards the end, so please be advised if you are sensitive to any of the material warned about in the beginning of the video. Really quickly, there were some details I forgot to mention in my last video that I felt the need to include. First, about the haunted houses, it's important to mention that first-time attendees who hadn't been warned beforehand about the content would most likely not be aware at all of the horrific imagery they'd be subjected to. The churches involved have admitted in the past to intentionally leaving out what was truly in store for attendees from their flyers promoting the events. Second, when talking about the controlling environment, I forgot about something I heard from multiple sources growing up. Allegedly, the Potter's House location in my town used to lock the doors during services to keep people from leaving. I'm not sure if they still do this, but there have been so many accounts of this happening in the past. They may have had to stop doing it due to it being a major safety hazard, but I can't confirm that. I compiled some of those accounts along with other statements from people within my own hometown in a video, so if you want to hear some more of what they had to say, I recommend giving it a watch. There were also some tussles with law enforcement that I read up on, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time going into elaborate details about each instance. The main thing of note is that in those cases, groups of Potter's House members got confrontational during their street evangelicalism, and the police had to get involved, with at least one instance of them assaulting officers. As noted in my video with citizen statements, some people have been harassed, chased, and even assaulted by Potter's House street evangelists. With those notes out of the way, let us continue our deep dive into the many problems of the Potter's House. I had been giving a tithe of 10% of my gross salary, which my pastor commanded me to do. I saw many friends get launched out to start their own churches, but none of them came back the same. They all secretly told me that once they were out there, the pastor virtually cut them off. No financial support for food, church bills, nothing. And all the while, the congregation was drilled for more money to support these families. But if we gave all this money, where did it all go? Who knows? There was absolutely no meaningful accountability for where the money went at Victory Chapel. Collecting donations or offerings is not an uncommon practice in churches. It's something that I've seen as problematic for a long time, but overall it isn't inherently financially exploitative. For the most part, they are seen as completely optional, and those who are struggling to make ends meet aren't pressured to contribute. As long as it's a choice as to where one's money goes and it doesn't put the contributor's own financial security at risk, it isn't too much of an issue. The issue comes into play when handing over one's own money is heavily pressured or downright enforced through the doctrine as a requirement. Some religious sects require their members to pay tithes, which is usually around 10% of a member's gross income before taxes. There will often be some sort of manipulative tactics such as, "Oh, you don't have to pay, but if you don't, you won't be granted access to these particular parts of our religion, which are required if you want salvation." Or members will be taught to believe that their money is a material object which they should be willing to give up because great are the rewards in heaven. Some even discourage their members from seeking higher education or well-paying jobs. As far as the Potter's House goes, it does seem that withheld salvation is a tactic they use to push tithing. One article did state that pastors use the fear of damnation and unacceptance against those who do not put their fair share in the basket. And another stated that many a times it was said over the pulpit, "If you do not pay your tithe, then I doubt if you're saved." I found a group of former members on Facebook that had posted a video that supposedly had Wayman Mitchell himself preaching about non-tithers going to hell, but unfortunately the video is no longer available, so I can't confirm its authenticity. Many member testimonies, former and present, state the heavy pressure to pay tithe or to continuously sacrifice their money to the church with contributions over and above 10% of their income. There's just so many statements about this that it's difficult to go through them all, but here are just some examples. Jeff Jacobson found himself destitute and hungry, living in a beat-up van in a parking lot, giving whatever money he had made to his church. The pastor, on the other hand, drove a fancy car and lived in a spacious, beautiful home. Mary and her sister Roberta became devoted followers, spending as much time as possible raising money and recruiting new members. Mitchell was their reverend leader, and they would do anything for him, including cutting their ties to the rest of their family. "The church was our home. After all, we were spending all our nights and all our money there," she says. "Our parents were very upset and hurt, but that didn't stop us." Dave Diver was a faithful member of the church for 20 years before he was expelled for asking where his donations were going. Diver gave $60,000 to the church over the years. When he asked what his last check of $2,000 was being used for, the church waited till the check cleared and then told him he would be arrested for trespassing if he returned. Rick Ross, an Arizona-based counselor who has helped dozens of people leave the church, said he believes, though he has no specific numbers, there are more former members of Christian Fellowship than there are current members. "I can't judge their hearts as they judge so many others, but I can judge their actions to see what their motives are," Ross said of the Christian Fellowship leaders. There seems to be a desire for power, money, and control. There's no sense of caring for the well-being and socioeconomic welfare of their members and followers. Musitelli figures he had given the Potter's House more than $20,000 in the past decade, yet all of his worldly belongings fit in the back of a small pickup truck. He has given up a college education because he said the church does not believe in education. "A church member's life is very focused," Musitelli said, "and anything done against the false doctrine of the church is punishable by eternal damnation. I even got behind in my child support payments so I could pay my tithes. I am not proud of this," Musitelli said. The church is paying for the pastor's house, his car, and his van. One place where a lot of that money does seem to go is into a practice known as church planting. This is basically establishing new churches under the same branch. As I said in the last video, the Potter's House has over 2,600 locations worldwide, so it's pretty apparent just how much they church plant. Remember that discipleship thing I brought up last time? Part of this involves sending the pastors trained under that program out to start their own churches, and of course the congregations have no say over who leads them. I personally found a certain aspect of this church planting process very interesting, as it ties into another topic I cover on Multi-Level Mess. That's right, guys. The Potter's House financial structure is allegedly set up in a pyramid structure. According to an investigation by Chris Hayes of KPHO-TV, aka CBS 5 News in Phoenix, Arizona, lots of people have been critical of this structure. If one parish is able to set up another church, that church must send 5% of its offerings back to the sponsor church and send 5% to the mother church in Prescott. Christian Fellowship Ministries says it spends most of its money on foreign fellowship outreach and that most of its churches are overseas. Now that sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Interesting how often my main topics of cults and pyramid schemes cross over. Members of Guam's gay community are miserable and in need of being saved by Jesus Christ. That's according to the controversial leader of Christian Fellowship Ministries, Wayman Mitchell. When I asked if he had a message for Guam's gay community, he said only Jesus can show them the way. They're not happy, they're miserable, and Jesus Christ can set them free. Unfortunately, there's no denying how often churches will use their religion as an excuse to discriminate against certain types of people. I've witnessed firsthand how many religious people will often cherry-pick verses from their doctrine in order to justify how they judge and sometimes harm others. The level of severity does depend on the individual, as well as what their religious leaders tell them, and sadly, the Potter's House is on the more severe end. First off, the blatant homophobia is very apparent. The founder, Wayman Mitchell, set a precedent for his followers by instilling some very harmful views. In my previous video, I spoke about how he claimed that homosexuality could cause deafness, and how the haunted houses held by the Potter's House would often depict a gay man dying of AIDS and going to hell for it. Mitchell was also recorded using homophobic slurs. I even found a video online with an audio recording of him claiming men are such and such a slur for wearing earrings.
Yet none of the secular stars is as daring as Tri-City Singers director Donald Lawrence, who dons 2 earrings. Does your mother know both your ears are pierced? Cracks Barry, his co-presenter. He answers, you know what? When I go visit her, I take them out. Well, why? Why would you take them out? Well, because his mother's a Bible-believing, fundamental, Holy Ghost-filled, praying mama. And he's convicted because he knows it's not right. Why not? If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Why are you going to change this when you go home to visit mama? Because you know that it destroys your testimony for Jesus Christ, because those are things that little put in your ears. I was over in San Diego. I was preaching on the beach, and I was just leaving the last night. God had been healing many people, and there was a young man came up to me. He was about 17, 18 years old, and he said, Pastor, would you just spare me a moment? I want to talk to you. And he was about this high, and he was trying to be with the end thing, and so he said I'm a Christian. He said as a matter of fact, he's the son of somebody that's fairly prominent in church, and so he said I want to know. I hadn't said a thing about the issue. He said I want to know. What I want to know is it wrong for a Christian to wear an earring? He had one in his ear. I said, well, I don't know if it's wrong, but I wouldn't wear anything that little are going to wear. He was deeply convicted. I said, why don't you give me that earring right now? He reached up, pulled it out. He said, I was paid $800 for that. I took it, threw it right out in the sand.
The church has also screened anti-gay movies to the public in the past. One article I found spoke about another pastor's heavily discriminatory stances after his passing, and I'd like to share some of it here. Controversial claims surface about the extreme anti-gay stance of an over-the-top former minister of Hamilton Evangelical Church, the Potter's House, after he is stabbed to death in Perth. The Hamilton leader of Evangelical Christian Church, the Potter's House Christian Fellowship Ministries, says the group has moderated its extreme anti-gay stance and is more open than it was during a controversial period through the mid-1990s. The fundamentalist religious group has been the subject of claim and counterclaim this week following the death of its former Hamilton pastor Richard Watson. Mr. Watson, who ministered for the Potter's House in Hamilton for 14 years, caused controversy in 1996 when he screened anti-gay films at the church's London St. base. This week, his widow Louise told the Waikato Times her late husband has grown to regret his actions and teachings while with the church, which she described as a cult led by Australian-based clerics who brainwashed members. Scott McGrath, the present pastor at the Potter's House in Hamilton, said the group has softened its stances on homosexuality since Mr. Watson's time in charge and would accept gay, lesbian, and transgender parishioners. However, he said, under biblical teachings, the church still viewed homosexuality as a sin, but we don't go out to bash homosexuality because there is no need to, and said the church would try to save any gay, lesbian, or transgender members. I can't begin to say how much this sort of thing frustrates me. The whole, we don't hate LGBTQ plus people. We openly welcome them, but we will constantly remind them that we think their existence is sinful and that they should be ashamed of themselves, and we will fix them. Seriously. Just be honest with yourselves if you're going to try that shit. It's just a roundabout way of saying we hate LGBTQ people, but we're fake as fuck about it. I'm sorry, this is a difficult topic for me personally as someone who's had to deal with this discrimination after being honest about my own sexuality. Former members have also testified to the Potter's House being anti-LGBT, with some speaking up about their struggles about being gay while raised in the church. Others, regardless of their sexuality, would be accused of being homosexual in an attempt to demonize them by the church after leaving. Remember that book, Churches That Abuse, that I brought up in the last video, and the man who was hospitalized from the exhaustion caused by his sacrifice to the church? This is what he and his wife had to say when they eventually left. The Potter's House, first to condemn, first to judge, and last to show any mercy, shunned Bruce and his wife. They were told that they were going to hell and that they had never been saved. They were also slandered by the leadership. I was sacrificing babies in my basement or was a homosexual or whatever. There is also quite a bit of misogyny within the church. Unfortunately, this is something that I saw some parallels to regarding my own religious upbringing, but to a more extreme degree. And yes, this discrimination would be in regards to their definition of a woman. We have a number of ladies in the church that work jobs, but we do not encourage for the wife to work, especially when there are children involved. In a real sense, the woman's place is in the home with her family. The ideal situation is for the wife to take care of the home, take care of the children, and be a wife to her husband. Now look, I do not have any issue with anyone choosing to be a stay-at-home parent. It's a tough job and one to be commended. However, I feel that should be 100% their choice and not something they are pressured into doing because of their church or society or whatever. And yes, I say stay-at-home parent because, believe it or not, everyone's family conditions are different and there are multiple reasons why it might not be a stay-at-home mom. There's just a lot of harmful beliefs enforced that are meant to make women seem lesser and to put them in their place, while also using them as scapegoats for the behavior of others. Unfortunately, some of these examples I'm going to have to save until the end of this video because it does get pretty bad. But here are some that I have found. I guess the biggest thing I saw was when women came to the headship for help, they were told that they were too emotional and just needed to get behind their husbands. Whilst pastoring, I ignored the decree along with others as I thought them rather silly and an aberration of North American Bible Belt culture. However, seeing these sort of things rigorously enforced in the mother church was quite depressing. There were many little laws. For instance, women were not allowed any public expression except in front of other women, and even that was frowned upon to some degree. I chose to leave because I no longer want to be a part of something that produced such control, idolatry, and fear. Of course, my old pastor would say I am not a Christian for writing this, an uncovered woman, rebellious, or even satanic. But I feel free. One particular story that drew my attention was the story of a woman who was involved in an affair with her pastor, and the differences in how the parties involved were treated. Her piece is a little long, but I wanted to share it in full. I was involved with the Potter's House for about 4 years. I was in my 20s when I was disfellowshipped for having an unrighteous relationship with a pastor. But he was not asked to leave. He was taken back to Mecca and was back pastoring within the year. To my knowledge, he has had an additional 2 affairs, the last resulting in leaving his wife for another woman. I was accused of having seduced this man through the use of witchcraft. However, he actually approached me first and started our affair. This occurred many years ago, but people I know through the church are still told that they had better have nothing to do with me because I am a known witch and a deceiver. They are also told that associating with me will cause them to go to hell. There was never, at any time, any redemption extended towards me. In fact, the area overseer was still calling pastors and warning them about me for 4 years after I left. Even when I sought biblical reconciliation to be at peace with these idiots, I was told that was not possible. Now, I have no problems with the disciplinary action taken against me. I was in sin, and I deserved everything I got and more. The problem for me is the difference in the way I was treated as opposed to the pastor involved, who it seems has since gone on to ruin more women's lives. I was very much a rebel the whole time I was in the Potter's House, but I brought most of the people into our church. When I first became involved with the church, I was doing the things that I did, such as taking them into my home and witnessing to them and really trying to help them because I loved Jesus. However, at some point, I simply began to serve the organization. I really did not think that I had checked my brain at the door. I constantly argued with my pastor about doctrine. In fact, at one point he told me I would have to leave the church eventually because the organization would never let me do the things he knew I was called to do. After I was thrown out, I literally had no place to go. I also discovered that I did not trust my own ability to make a decision. It was months before I was able to think clearly again. I was bombarded by church members with their belief that I had lost my destiny in God, but I knew that was a crock. Over the years, I have found a marvelous healing and restoration. I am more alive now than I ever was back then. I walk in a new power and anointing that I have never been allowed to find in that organization. My point in sharing my story is that I am not the only woman that was involved with these pastors. I personally know of at least half a dozen. This organization covers for some of them unless they are just too obnoxious about it. No one believes us or is willing to walk with us out of this situation. They just feed us to the wolves. In the Potter's House, it seems the woman is always to blame in sexual sin, and for some reason, the men are just helpless victims. Before we move on to the heavier stuff, I wanted to leave off on an anecdote of my own, as relayed to me by someone I went to high school with. I'm just going to call her Sammy, which is obviously not her real name. She had gone to a Potter's House service as a guest with her friend, and she did concur with the stories about the doors being locked during service. Now, the important things to note about Sammy back in the day is that she had short dyed hair and piercings. So when she attended that service, she was forced to put a cover over her head to hide her hair and piercings the whole time. The way she related, she seemed a little humiliated, but overall just bewildered and amused by the whole thing. I don't think she ever went back. It was clear to her, though, through her interactions, that she was discriminated against for not fitting their ideal image of what a young woman should look like. Alright, this is where things get dark. So I'm giving a final warning before we move on. The rest of this video is going to be discussing abuse within and related to the church, as well as a murder. So if you're uncomfortable with these topics, feel free to click out of the video or skip ahead to the timestamp. For everyone still here, let's keep going. My husband and I met the Christian author of a book about spiritual abuse at a conference. And after we explained that we were once involved with the Potter's House, the author comforted us and said, "Yes, I know about the Potter's House. It must have been hard." I'll be honest, this is where it became difficult to write the script for this video. As horrible as the things I'm going to be discussing are, it is important to cover if I'm going to paint a clear picture about the harm the Potter's House has caused to others. Now, I do need to make an important note here that I've learned that there is a church in Dallas, Texas called the Potter's House, or T.D. Jakes Potter's House, that isn't affiliated with the overall Christian Fellowship Church's branch. The reason I have to bring this up is that in my research, I did find some very concerning articles involving them, but they are still a different church and aren't what's being discussed in these videos. I just had to clarify that. There have been many allegations of abuse of power, as well as spiritual and psychological abuse. Churches that abuse describes what members go through as pastoral and psychological abuse. Some have said their pastors would get angry and abusive when people tried to talk to them about leaving. Some of this mental abuse kicks in after members leave through a practice called shunning, which I'll be going into more in the next video. It isn't unheard of in religious cults, as these abuses are used to control members, and the effects last long after members leave. The abuse in the Potter's House, sadly, doesn't just harm the minds of their members. It goes far beyond that. In Fullerton, California in 1990, a member of Jacob's Well, which had been a branch of the Potter's House up until 2 months prior, and whom had been involved with them for at least a year, confessed to killing a 3-year-old he was babysitting. Scarily enough, he was entrusted with their care right after fleeing another crime scene where he had attempted to murder his mother and attack her boyfriend. Mere hours later, he would stab the girl to death. He claimed that he believed his mother was Satan, and the girl who the mother had previously babysat had her body taken over by the devil. He would receive a sentence of 26 years to life, as well as an additional life sentence. He was scheduled for a parole suitability hearing back in February of this year, but that ended up being postponed for 6 months. It is crucial to note that he'd had psychological issues in the past and had admitted to the church that he was on methamphetamines shortly before that terrible night. However, he was deemed sane at the time of the murder. Now, I cannot say for certain how much of the Potter's House teachings influenced the killer in his actions before the church split, and it wouldn't be right for me to speculate, especially knowing that there were other factors involved. It's just distressing to learn about, and my heart goes out to the girl's family. This was the only instance of murder that I could find that ties back to the Potter's House. I wish that I could find some comfort in that, but one is still too many. Unfortunately, there have been multiple accounts of everything else in this section. There have been at least a few documented instances of child abuse linked to the church. In 2007, a Potter's House pastor in Albany, Oregon, was arrested on assault charges after his 17-year-old son reported the excessive corporal punishment on his 13-year-old brother, who was found with what was described as extreme red marks, welts, and bruising on his buttocks, thighs, and arms. These were inflicted with a 16-inch wooden paddle that was cracked and time-worn from constant use. I know that spanking children is a very touchy subject with mixed feelings, and I'll have to be honest that I'm very much against it, especially when it is done excessively and when tools are used to deliberately increase the amount of pain. However, the article I read hinted that the teachings of the church might have encouraged this form of punishment. I believe in the Bible, and what does the Bible say about spanking? That's how we raised our children. I'm sorry, my children lived through it. I'm sure everybody else's will. Yeah, lady, just because someone lives through a terrible experience doesn't mean it won't be traumatic for them or it isn't abusive. Thankfully, another interviewee seemed to have different thoughts on the matter. I'd rather raise my voice than raise my hand. And even though in the Bible it says, spare the rod, spoil the child, I still feel spanking your children is not an appropriate measure. There's other means you can take. In one Potter's House church, a girl who was about 4 to 5 years old at the time told her mother after a visitation with her father about the traumatic experience her pastor put her through. The pastor dressed up as the devil and had her put her hand in a bucket of blood with a cow's heart in it. While her hand was in the bucket, the pastor yelled, "You will never get your hand out!" An Indiana court determined that the girl had PTSD from the experience and forbade her father from ever taking her back to the Potter's house. The pastor insisted that the blood was fake, but admitted to doing it, saying he was trying to scare her away from sex and drugs. You heard me. He was trying to scare a 5-year-old away from sex and drugs by forcing her to stick her hands in a bucket of blood. When I was 5 years old, I didn't even know what sex was, and my school would teach us about the dangers of drugs through a much more informative and a lot less harmful means. Worse yet is the pastor didn't seem to see what the issue was at all, even in retrospect. That's the problem with this generation that does not understand fear. Dude, she was like a kindergartner. Kids aren't expected to understand the importance of fear at that age. Experiences like that aren't going to tell them to fear something that won't come until way later in their lives. It's going to tell them to fear going to church because the adults they are supposed to trust may force them to stick their hands in blood and feel organs for no reason. And that's exactly what happened to the child in this instance, who reportedly said, "I think they're going to do it again if I go back." By far, though, the most reported form of abuse within the Potter's house is sexual assault. Here are just the accounts I was able to find within my limited time researching. A 16-year-old girl was raped by a church member. When she told her pastor, he said that she probably deserved it and to shut up about it. Or else. Her mother also tried to speak to the pastor, but was told that it was the girl's fault and there was nothing he could do. The founder, Wayman Mitchell himself, told the Arizona Republic that the girl hadn't reported it to the pastor because if she had, she would have been told to report it to the authorities. But he also claimed that she was raped because she was bitter and vindictive. A former member of the Door Fellowship learned that the husband of her close friend was molesting his daughter. Even though he was arrested and given a court order to stay away from the child, the church still allowed him to attend services. When the woman talked to her pastor, he told her, "Well, he was not the only guilty party here," ignoring that the victim was a mere child. The girl and mother were not offered any support by their church, and the mom ended up suicidal, so the member took the child in and raised her. A senior church leader of a Potter's House location in Cape Town, South Africa, was charged for raping 4 of his own daughters, aged 7, 11, 15, and 18. He also had other daughters, aged 2 and 4, but they were not included in the charges. One article I found near the end of researching this subject told the stories of several women. The translation was a bit awkward, but this is what I was able to gather. In a branch in the Netherlands, multiple women were sexually abused by a pastor. He originally lost his position but was allowed to remain a member. Over time, he became a pastor again. One girl who joined the church was having a secret relationship with a male member, but he ended up raping her. She went to the pastor, but he told her she was lying and possessed and shouldn't have seduced him. He took the boy's side and told him he was lucky the matter was handled in the church and not before a secular judge, because women are the majority there. Demonic possession is apparently a common excuse used in the church community worldwide, especially when women try to speak up about their sexual abuse. A young girl in the US was sexually assaulted for 3 years by a man in executive power. When she tried to speak up, the pastors would laugh and joke about it. When her parents left the church, they confronted Pastor Jeff Renz, the son-in-law of Wayman Mitchell, who accused the girl of destroying the congregation. And after their leaving, he would continue to call the girl the whore from the pulpit. As far as she was aware, the perpetrator continued to abuse girls, but they kept silent. A woman with an arranged marriage through the church became a victim of serious domestic and sexual abuse, even during pregnancy and after the birth. She wound up at the hospital several times with black eyes and bruises. She just kept trying to do what the church told her to do. Obey her husband, pay her tithes, attend church 7 days a week, and everything would be fine. Part of the contribution to this is an alleged worldwide issue I wasn't fully aware of in my last video, though I suppose there were allusions to it through the heavy control over dating and marriage, and that is arranged marriages within the church. It supposedly isn't brutally forced per se, but heavily pressured through the pastors who will match up young couples and say, "This is the will of God for you." The article these stories were shared in mentioned the following. What promotes sexual abuse is the fact that members, men, but especially women, share with the pastor their choices, wishes, problems, and sins, even if they play a role in marriage. An American member received marriage counseling from her pastor together with her ex-husband. The pastor asked her to tell in detail what she did when she was intimate with her husband. They also demanded that I have sex with him, her ex-husband. Otherwise, her husband would inform the pastor. It is clear to me that this is a widespread issue within the Potter's house, where girls and women especially suffer from the sexual abuse of male members and superiors, and are often blamed for it, while their rapists receive little to no repercussions from the church, allowing the abuse to continue and for more to fall victim. That was difficult to go through. Jeez. I think after that we could all use a nice sip of water and a couple deep breaths. Thankfully, the next and final video in the series will at least be a bit less heavy. In it, I will be talking about the aftermath of the Potter's house, focusing on the survivors, the shunning they have endured, and their recovery. Until then, thank you for watching. If you want more of this type of content, please consider liking and subscribing. Check out my Facebook and Twitter, as well as my blog at multilevelmess.wordpress.com. I hope to see you all back in the graveyard very soon.